Fae Myenne Ng is the author of 3 books, and each one is absolutely extraordinary. Bone was a PEN/Faulkner finalist and an American Book Award winner, her first novel. Steer Towards Rock, her second, was also equally acclaimed and won her the Rome Prize, and I think a Guggenheim, a Lannan Prize, an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, an NEA, and a Radcliffe Institute fellowship. Her most recent book, which was 15 years in the making, has many of the same qualities as her 2 extraordinary novels, but it's actually a memoir. It's called Orphan Bachelors, on being a confession baby, Chinatown daughter, bye-bye sister, caretaker of exotics, literary balloon peddler, and grand historian of a doomed American family. I came to each of these novels with a sense of thrill and discovery, which is all the more amazing since I've known Fae since 1972, when we were freshmen together at the University of California, each of us in our first writing class ever. She was always an exceptional writer, even as an undergraduate. I followed her to Columbia. She was always the writer I wanted to read. And yet, when I read the books fully formed, when I first read Bone, I was astonished. And I felt that way every time. It's such a pleasure to introduce Fae Myenne Ng. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Mona, for that warm introduction. I don't see Mona often, but every time I do, it's very special. I'd like to thank the UCLA English department and the students who came to the talk. That was a wonderful conversation, and maybe you'll ask more questions. I'd like to thank the Hammer Museum, Shannon Cinnaba, everyone who is working so hard to make this run smoothly. And I want to thank all of you for coming and joining me in this evening. I want to read to you from this book, Orphan Bachelors. Mona did a great thing by reading the very long-winded subtitle. And I can say a lot more about that, but I'd be explaining. So maybe if it's not clear, we can talk about it after. I'd like to go into the book and share some aspects of how I came to write it and what was in my mind and what was my goal. My mother was a teacher in pre-communist China, and she taught me that a story is fact. Telling a story is unconditional. You get nothing back. It's like time passing. It's gone. It's told. It happened. She also taught me that a secret is a manipulation of story. And I learned growing up, getting an education, that a lie is a wonderful and possibly terrible thing, but it's something that all writers play with. In 1940, my father, as a 16-year-old, memorized a book of lies and entered this country as the son of a Chinese-American citizen. In 1956, the year I was born, the Chinese confession program was enacted, calling for all these men who memorized Book of Lies to get into the country, confess. My father did confess, although he had to agree to give up his passport and agree to possibly be deported. If he didn't, he could be picked up and deported anyway. A lot of choice. In 1966, the last year of the program, he did confess for the marriage. So I'd like to read to you from the beginning of the book, the first chapter, to give you a sense of what I was trying to capture in story. When my father breathed his last, I drove over 2 bridges before his hearing departed, and I crawled into the house on my hands and knees, calling for him as if we were in China. If I tell him how long it took to complete this manuscript, he might wink and mention Sima Qian, who chose castration so he could finish his long overdue records of the grand historian. My parents couldn't read my novels in English, and when translated, found the simplified Chinese frustrating and gave up. A seamstress who could sew up copies of dresses from sight, a sailor who could endure the silence and solace of the seas. Their whole lives were consumed with work for the family. They did not want to read a copy of the original. This teaches me that translation is not only the act of deference, but also of defiance, and that immigration, like any departure from land or language, is the supreme sacrifice. Inside the home, Mom taught us to call our father Der, an ancient pronunciation that was long and low, as if pulled from the shadow of the moon. Ma and Der taught me to speak and write beyond the story, even beyond translation. They did not always get along, but they taught me how to get through life. When painting a tiger, first draw the bones. When building a house, consider the wind. When writing, consider the vessel of time that holds a story. Maybe that's also a guide on how to read this book. When reading, honor what you can't fully inhabit. This book has no simple timeline. I've left our fissures in because what can't be known or forgiven is part of our history. I've written our hopes and disappointments, and also our illusions. I've tried to respect the unknowable and also the untranslatable. I have borrowed from life to make the story come alive on the page. Borrowing is the word my father used to cajole understanding. Of his own life, he often said he was borrowing to stay in this country, to stay in this family. As a child, I believed his stories. As a writer, I write his lies. So, perhaps, this book can be, as my father was, an alien resident. I think they've changed that now to resident alien. Big difference. So the second section I wanted to write to you is about harnessing story, or that was what I was thinking when I was trying to do this section. And the section is really important to me, but it's not often mentioned because it's something that is very new in my attempt at writing. It is inspired. These are the ancestral tablets, and they're inspired by the form of honoring our dead. In the ruling class families and the imperial families, there would be huge portraits of ancestors, and they would be life-size, and they would sit in an ancestral shrine in the room, in its own special room in the house, and the ancestors would live there. In other homes, they would simply be a black and white photograph, and this would be very stern. Nobody smiled. This was stern and severe, and as a child, I remember these huge photographs on top of cars in a funeral procession in Chinatown, and they would be really severe. And then these photographs would be put into the house, and a child would know to obey because the ancestors are watching. In my home, it was really simple. We had the name of my great-grandfather on a piece of rice paper. I know that other families have names written on wooden tablets, and I thought the beauty of just the name was exquisite. And so my goal in writing these sections was to create on the page a representation of a tablet to honor the dead, to keep them alive and to honor their lives. So what I did was I considered the story that made these people's lives unique and shine. And so I have 2 ancestral tablets, one of the father and one of the mother, and they're self-explanatory. If not, you can ask me questions. Before I read those, I want to tell you something about the exclusion marriage, which my parents had. And this is just a quick paragraph about the exclusion marriage, because in 1882 to 1943, full exclusion. 1943 to 1966, little exclusion. There was a quota. 105 Chinese were allowed in the country. That's like 9. I'm terrible at math, but I figured it out. That's like 9 Chinese a month. And you know, that's not a lot. That's not going to correct the sexual imbalance, because we must consider 1875, the Page Act forbid all Chinese women because they were deemed immoral. 1882, they decided get rid of all the other Chinese, the men. So there was no way families could be created. So the Exclusion Act, in many ways, not only was it an act for labor, it was also an act against the procreation of the Chinese American family. It was in effect for 61 years, that is 4 generations of the unborn. My father always raged. It's a brilliant piece of legislation. You didn't have to kill any Chinese. You just made sure no Chinese babies were born. So the first 2, oh, I should tell you another thing that my father did as an exclusion husband. It was a troubled marriage, but he did this one great act, which I have always loved him for. My mother found her grandfather hanging dead, and she was deeply, deeply hurt. My father bribed himself onto a voyage to Hong Kong, and in the 2-hour shore leave, got himself to the wet market, got 5 snake gall bladders, which he believed would cure her sorrow and revitalize her courage. Now, these people had no money for a Western doctor or therapy. They had no belief. So this thinking of what would cure my wife, what would save her soul, was magnificent, but even more so, he sailed 7,000 nautical miles. This is romantic. And this is extreme expression of care. And I ask you, how many marriages even have that? One act of absolute care. So I'm going to read 2 ancestral tablets, and then I'm going to read a third, but it's not a tablet. It's from the child to the mother. The child is me. I am not dead. I can't have an ancestral tablet. So it's written in the form of a letter, because letters in those days were so special. They traveled many, many days and weeks to get to the receiver, and they were written by scribes who wrote the same letter for everybody. You just changed the name. But yet, when it was received in China, it was as if it was a direct scent of love. And so I wrote my letter to prepare for my ancestral tablet. Ancestral tablet, a husband's words to his wife. In my bachelor year, I came to the school and observed you from afar. Later, you would tell me what you saw at the edge of the courtyard, not my person, but the light from the stone on my ring. That refracted light caught your heart. Your face glowed as you told me how you'd never imagined a jewel throwing brightness so far. That day, when your eyes followed that diamond light toward me, I saw a girl so young she still played paper shuttle games. I wasn't like the other bachelors who enjoyed the gambling dens and tea houses and chased the dragon. I preferred being alone and bought a pair of songbirds to take for walks along the riverbank. After I met all the prospective brides, I chose you, an orphan. I didn't, as others did, pursue marriage to increase family wealth. Instead, I chose a bride to decrease all that family sorrow hanging between us. Ancestral tablet, a mother's words to her eldest. When my time comes, your sister will cry, and I will not be able to walk the road. Lead her aside so I can go. As my firstborn, I gave you my trust. You took care of the others, and this made your character. Then, like me, you left your mother and made your own life. As I bore my mother's hardships, you witnessed mine. Life. A mother gives. A mother is old. Your father's story captured me, and I bequeathed it to you. I did not tell the others. You would grow into the business of stories, but you already understood. Stories are dangerous. Always keep something for yourself. This preserves desire, the seed of all loving. Whatever he endured in America was nothing compared to what he'd suffered in China. I calculated my affinity. What is the worth of family? Without me, he'd be an orphan bachelor, begging restaurant scraps, wandering DuPont, squandering his days in gambling parlors. I bore him 4 treasures, but my true labor was bearing his running away. All those years he took to sea to escape his family. I endured it because he was the boy who could not cry his way home. Every home became a prison. My daughter, I bequeath no gold, only this hard eye. Do not love in pity. Throw grief into the ocean and let the queen mother of the 4 seas take the man who asks and asks. You waited till just a few hours before your impending marriage to call, so I only had time to tell you about the magical creature I saw before my own wedding. At the riverbank, the sky was overcast, the air humid, rain was coming. Behind the thick clouds, something flickered, and I saw the long-winged creature, its tail a brush riding hope into the sky. I kept the vision a secret until I crossed the ocean of peace. I cried tears of worry and want, 100 years of happiness, 100 ascending visions. You were displeased. I do not ask for explanation, and you do not need my forgiveness. This is the voyage of mothering. I want your heart safe in another's embrace before I ascend my road. 25. I am the eldest daughter of the eldest daughter of another eldest daughter. Without children of my own, the lineage of the Babai, eldest daughter, the take charge girl, ends with me. The last time I saw my mother, I brought her a thin-skinned orange. As I placed it in her palm, I asked if she remembered the Lunar New Year when I returned home with nothing in hand. Ma remembers. Mother also forgave. When the caregiver urged her to speak my name, my mother's voice was opium-rich as she said the name that she herself gave me, the ideogram for intelligence, the word meaning brightness, light, light, beaming hope. I whispered into my mother's ear. I uttered the word of adoration, Han, the word she'd always used to express love. Ma, I embrace you for love. Ma, I embrace you for life. Ma, I Han you with all my life. Hospice advised me to use the word goodbye, to give permission, you can go. I could not translate that sentiment, so I did not use their words. This child will not tell her mother what to do, when to go. When I took my mother's hand, a phrase from childhood returned, a hopeful, affectionate, even romantic expression of farewell, like arrivederci, okay. May we have the fortune to meet again, okay. I closed one hand over the other, extending my fist like a disciple saying farewell to the master. My mother was ascending the mountain. Ma, I caressed her. Ma, I love you so much. I will see you again. Dear great and honorable mother, below whose knee I prostrate, 親愛父母大人膝下. In the time since you've walked your road, I've lived with two of your sentences. They are dear to me for the mystery of you. These sentences are about my father. No, they're about your husband. In the first, you speak directly about your pleasure, skin so soft on his arm and more alongside his thigh. The second sentence is about your union and about mothering. Together we've raised 4 children, and yet he still doesn't love me. Mother, you speak about love, but instead of your usual Han, the veiled word meaning embrace, you use the word ngoi, meaning love. It's an unusual construction for a Chinese sentence, but I know that you are fitting Western intimacy you've learned in this country into what you've always desired, abiding love. With this translation, you married stoic immigrant loyalty with free pioneer love and made an American sentence. As your firstborn, you let me see more. When I was too young to comprehend your feelings, you told me to hold memory aside, to trust time. Like gold, feelings get brighter. That lesson has not only taught me about writing, but it has also kept you dearly by my side. Mother, today I am the elder in your stead, and I remember your last words, which I had hid for fear of feeling your loneliness. What you told me now shines. A mother owes because she brings forth life. Debt is not a burden, but a joy. Your first girl. So this third section, as I was writing it, I was thinking about the whole book, because of the book, as much as it is about family and history, and it's about writing and teaching. And so I thought about enduring stories. I thought about who a story is for and how to tell a story. And also the illusions and also the delusions of stories. After completing my own manuscript, I considered who would read this. I won't be hurt if my sister doesn't. She's read my other books and has said, I know where you got everything. This is intimacy. Anthony's an electrician, and before he read my first book, he prepared himself and told me, I want to concentrate. This moved me, as if the currents of fact and fiction were dangerously crucial to him. Perhaps if he doesn't read this book, we might be saved from the firepower of more understanding. Tim would have read it first and fast, laughing at all the secrets. Nelson, my brother-in-law, is a prophodontist who makes works of art to work in the body. Noses, ears, and eyes so detailed the eyelashes flutter. Perhaps this is how a book should work in the body, useful as well as artful. As my father neared his own death, he became more and more like the ancients, speaking in parables and idioms, storing truth in his belly, guarding and protecting us from his depository of discontent. The lure, the myth-making, and maybe even the flat-out making it all up are now our story. In his final years, I stopped trying to read his mind or guess his needs. I accepted that his true desires would always evade me. Perhaps this was the best road. I can see him winking, hear his gentle chiding. Not all has to be spoken or written, that the superior one trusts the truth in the belly. Knowing did not involve feeling, and feeling did not demand understanding. Attention was enough payment. As I use the word perhaps, I hear my father using the word pay you. As a child, I understood it as his way of inviting possibility. Perhaps my father knew that Mom had told me his story, and that by sidestepping that acknowledgement, he freed me. Perhaps leaving his story alone gave me the will to write it out of our lives. Our orphan bachelors believed that the perfection and completion were false markers on the road. When working in the gold mines, on the railroad, in the galleys of ships, in the underbelly of kitchens and the basements of sweatshops, what's important is to hold something back for the self. This is our blood of hope. Perhaps Ma told me the story I needed to carry, and perhaps Dad didn't tell me what would imprison me. Though written in the barbarian's language, may this manuscript translate to the song of everlasting hope that travels wordlessly back home. Okay, thank you. I've lost track of time. I think I'm at my limit.
Faye, you took 15 years to write this book. Tell us about what that process was and whether you feel that, I mean, one feels the density of all that thought and all those.
Yes, 15 years is a long time. Could have been longer. I tell people I just wanted it to be published so I could stop writing it. It changed a lot. My novels were maybe practice exercises to write this. It deals with this whole scenario of immigration and of telling lies and telling stories. And so and my parents had both died. And so perhaps there was also a change in how I saw the story. During the first two books, I was involved with caring for them. And so that occupied a lot of my energy. And after, I had to reflect on how they lived, who they were, still in my mind.
What was your process writing the book? Did you write sections of it? Did you write a draft? Did you consider this book, did you start it in any way as fiction and migrate to more ruthless honesty?
This is a good question because I think my work changed in this book. It still has I'm still creating character, trying to understand story. And so perhaps I did start thinking of short stories because I was working, I was teaching, and you know, when you teach, there's not a lot of focus. And then I started, when my father passed, I started to understand the story in a deeper way, and that it could have value as nonfiction. I think I am moving through fiction, nonfiction, and I don't know how that's going to...
In a porous kind of
Yeah,
way.
yes. And I think I was also trying to understand how language had changed. So I was exploring a lot of, I don't want to say boundaries, but I was trying to break down some doors.
Talk about that a little more.
There's what my mother taught me about story being fact and secrets being manipulation of story. I thought about that a lot. And then there's a genre, I feel, in America that comes from exclusion and confession, and that is the lie, writing the lie. So that is what I came to writing this book. I understood that these conditions of exclusion and confession created a sense of story in which you had to hold back, but you also had to be fully transparent. I hate that word, fully open. You know, in Chinese, tanbak is white, blank and white, and I like that a lot more than transparency. So there, and the thing about the confession program is you were not individual. If you confessed, you had to name your blood and paper families. So the loyalty was damaged. And so I think in this book, I tried to understand, this is the new American loyalty. You had to calculate what you could sacrifice in terms of your own intimacy and your own loyalty to family, to self. And so this was maybe my moving through the two forms.
Your mother told you to always hold something back for yourself. Did you find yourself holding anything back for yourself in the writing of this book? It seems to me, really, it's all there. It feels like that as a reader.
Yeah.
That might not be the truth.
I don't think the book would have worked if I kept something back. Talking to the students on campus, this is a new thought I had this morning. I don't look too good in this book. Meaning,
I don't agree with that.
I was kind of mean to my brother. And so I thought on that simplistic level, when I was writing that, I was brutal to him, but I had to write that. I had to write that. And that was part of revealing the complexities of what, hiding your identity and confessing and then reforming your identity, that has bearing on the intimacy of a family. And that is what I understood damaged my family and my relationships with my siblings. And that wasn't easy to write, but it needed to be written.
How do you feel I felt, I don't agree with Faye's assessment of that. I felt that I always trust a writer more when they hold themselves to account. You know, when they take responsibility. There's so many opportunities as a writer to slant things in favor of yourself, really. And I think you resist that.
Yeah.
You talk about a little bit, you bear on it in this, but there's other places in the book too where you talk about the Western idea of family, the Western idea of love, and how that affected your generation.
Oh, that's a huge question. That's very complicated.
You grew up with both of those echoes, huge in your.
Yes, because the exclusion marriage is unique because, well, you know, you have green card marriages. I mean, what is marriage anyway? The Chinese character of marriage is the radical of a woman next to the character of family, and the character of family is a pig with a roof. You know, if we're using English, you know, it's a lady with a pig. You know, doesn't sound like marriage, but Chinese people love their pigs, and you know, they live in the home, and you know, a woman, you know, so bringing that into English, you know, that's why I told the story about. The story is better written than the way I told it, about my father taking the 7,000-mile journey to buy snake gall for my mother. It appears that gesture was the point, but it was pointless. It was absolutely pointless. But the gesture of, you know, the journey, it's so romantic. I'm gonna go.
Hope.
Yeah, the hope.
The hope.
Exactly, the hope. 7,000 miles, and who knows what he was doing on the job, hauling garbage cans. It wasn't for 30 days. But it was the possibility of expressing his love and care, which in an exclusion marriage, it's a very troubled marriage, but what marriage isn't?
There's a question. I'm fascinated in your work. You tend to write stories that are essentially very, very determined. You know, I mean, you write about characters whose lives have definite limits, you know, and that they cannot exceed, and they're external limits, and yet you manage to make them hopeful stories. And that's your great gift, I think, to write about the doomed with hope. That's sort of been your project all along, when you think of it.
This is true friendship. Mona really understands and knows my work. It's the generation, you know, when you got nothing, when you leave China, you know, China's even worse than America, and you get to America and it's really bad. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You make hope, and you give it to the next generation.
And the next generation can run with it. One more question, and then I know a lot of the audience members have questions they want to ask too. But I wanted to just talk to you about how you use Cantonese in this book. Which is, they mentioned a funny story. Her publisher took umbrage at the title because, as we know, most readers in America are women these days. So they thought, bachelors in the title, you know, the ladies aren't going to like that. But meanwhile, you do. I found, you know, I don't read Cantonese, and yet it's a completely comprehensible book, and yet it's there. Talk about that. That's not easy.
Thank you, thank you. And I love that you read the long-winded subtitle. I was going to do that, but I would have been explaining too much. The subtitle, just to get to it, is very Cantonese. I mean, they just go on and on and on, you know. And it's also, if you know, this is a museum, so I just wanted to point out, this is a painting. The cover is a painting by the late John Wesley, and it's the Night Titanic, and it's huge. It's life-size. This is the Titanic. Hull of the ship, waves, porthole, charging into the night Titanic. This is the shipping manifest. It is also a record of Chinese American history. And so I just crammed it all in. It's a very Cantonese, Ba is very Cantonese. It's a person who is confident. And this is what I try to teach my students. Be confident. Walk into a room and command it. Do not be afraid. There's no question you can't ask. There's nothing you can't do. And so this is what the Orphan Bachelors who had nothing taught us. They had nothing. Are we going to show them that we got nothing? No, we owed it to them to take their nothingness and to give hope to the next generation. So in the Cantonese, in here is really unique because I use several very ancient Chinese, Cantonese words. I used it in the, Pao Jai, which is when Crocker is, he won't pay the Chinese equal rates, equal wages. And so that is a very Cantonese name, word about alchemy. Melting down metals to create an explosion or implosion, and it further becomes to fix someone with fire. And it ends, that phrase, that section ends with a translation, which is very Californian. We blew Crocker's mind. So I moved from a very ancient, archaic Cantonese term, because our parents used to say this, you're bad, I'm gonna Pao Jai you. And we'd run. And to Crocker. So it's a way to make language fluid. And you notice that in the section that I read, I use the word Han. That's the only time I use Toisanese, because it's a malign dialect. Cantonese is, you know, sexy and romantic, in the mood for love. It's just, it's just wonderful. But Toisan is a waiter yelling at you. And so I use Han in the most intimate, loving moment. That's the only time I use Toisan. And then I also try to work with the cadence. So the English creates the Cantonese in cadence and in rhythm and in diction.
That's very cool.
That's why it took 15 years. I was writing a book in Cantonese that they can't write.
It's worth it. I should mention too, right, as raise your hands for questions and people will come around with microphones. But while we're doing that, I should just mention that this wonderful book, which Faye will sign afterwards, is just won a major award, which I'm not allowed to say what it is, but watch for it. It'll be announced soon. Okay.
Hello. So you talk about oral storytelling, and a lot of the stories that you have are family stories. How have those stories changed, and how has your telling of them changed, either as you've gotten older or repeated the stories in different contexts?
That's an interesting question. I think that I try to contain the telling of the stories in their truth in this book. They could change after. I could write another book and I could change them. But I think what was important was to find the truth and the rhythm of the truth for this book within this family. within the sorrow of this family. So I think that that was the framework for telling the story. How did exclusion and confession create the grief in this family? Does that answer your question? Oh, throughout my life. I think I'm telling the same story. I think I've told this story in Bone and in Rock, Steer Toward Rock, and I think there are aspects, maybe this is what you're asking, there are aspects of the same condition, and I'm telling them hopefully in a larger, more interesting way with each work.
Well, your understanding has changed too.
Yes.
Thank you. What was the advantage of the confession? Why did your father confess? Why not just?
It's complicated. It's in the book. He needed to confess so that his wife could bring her mother over.
So that if he didn't confess, then she couldn't come here?
If he didn't confess, he could always be deported because his paper brothers could confess and name him.
I want to ask a question from the passage you read, in which your mother said, or you said, that stories are dangerous and you must hold something back. So one of the most dramatic story in the book is your mother taking you out of Chinatown to tell you that your father was actually kidnapped when he was a child. So to me, the whole thing about the fake name and the real name is really ironic, because the real name is also fake because it wasn't his biological name. You never mentioned that in the book. So, but the thing that puzzled me a lot is that, okay, your mother took you out to tell you this very haunting story, but asked you not to tell, not even to talk to your father about it. So I think she told you the story because she did not want you to laugh out of pity, but at the same time want you to know how horrible things that happened to your father, and that's why she won't leave him. So that's very understandable. But what I don't understand is why she didn't want you to tell your siblings. And your brothers were so mean to your father at the end, right? You know, they won't talk to your father, kind of excommunicated him. If they knew what happened to him in China, would that not create sympathy for the father? So I just don't know what you meant exactly when, or what your mother meant, that stories are dangerous. Why do you want to hold that back from your siblings?
This is very complex. I think I was trying to write about my relationship with my mother that she chose to tell me, and that she entrusted the story, and that made me no longer a child, and that created my own sense of responsibility to my siblings. My obsession was to tell my father, not to tell my siblings. And that was the American in me. I wanted to tell him his own story. I don't know why my mother didn't tell my siblings. She chose to tell me the story, perhaps because I was her first, and she trusted that I would understand the story. And so this is an attempt to create the intimacy between my mother and myself, that the story kept us close. I don't know that if she told my brothers that they would be sympathetic or compassionate. And maybe she knew that that wouldn't work in the same way. A story worked to open that up in me, but I imagine my mother knew her other children. Does that answer your question? No?
King Kok, you wanna give it one more go?
Well, I can talk about the Cantonese, why is it so important? Because it's not just a variation of Chinese, it's really the opposite of Chinese in many ways. So, for instance, the Chinese really avoid the expression dead. So when I gave a talk on Chinese American writers and I want to quote Jeffrey Paul Chan's "Eat everything before you die," my host won't let me. He said, no, in Chinese, you really don't talk about dead, right? So, I talk about a Cantonese opera singing with a partner in Beijing, and I said, can we mention that we sang in Guangzhou? He said, no, can you just say that we sing Cantonese opera without mentioning that it is a heng yu, a fragrant sacrifice, meaning dead? Whereas with Cantonese, we add dead to everything. 死咁靚, you are so beautiful like dead. 死咁肉酸, you're so ugly that you're like dead. So it's an intensifier. So it really also shows that when I first read the stereotype about Asian women, this lotus blossom, I say, where is that coming from? That's not my culture. So it's not like just like a different kind of Chinese. It's the opposite of what people think about Chinese. So that's why we really need to preserve this really wonderful heritage.
There was a question here too.
Hi.
Hello, Quinn.
My name is Quinn Zakaski. I'm a recent student of Professor Fae. I'm sitting here with 3 students. And one of my favorite scenes from the memoir was you describing a photograph of your mother teaching in China, and how she pointed out to you one student who would always fall asleep. And you said, I never want my charges to fall asleep. Can you explain to that? Can you explain what you meant by that? And when students finish any of your courses at either UCLA or UC Berkeley, what do you hope for them in the future?
Quinn's an amazing writer. I can't see who else is here. Is that Ellie? Chris. That's a scene which inspired me because it was a really tiny little boy who was probably just tired. But I held on to it because it made me come into class and really want to teach you something that would wake you up. So, I say a lot of things in class, right? And I say no notes because you got to pay attention. If you're taking notes, you're not paying attention. So maybe the question is for you. What have you taken, Quinn?
Professor Faye always taught us, as you said, to be confident, to be an artist. She always stressed that during her time in New York, she learned how to eat nails for breakfast. And there were so many stories. And one of the first things she said to us, one of our first classes, she said, my sister is never going to read this book.
That proved to be prophetic.
And it's like, oh, that's kind of sad. And then I read the novel and I understand it more. But you always taught us that to be an artist and to especially be a writer, you give the story out to the world. It's no longer yours. And to have thin skin when writing and being transparent, but to also have thick skin and to not let people push you around and belittle your art.
That is beautiful. And let me just say, Quinn is an amazing person and a beautiful writer. And let's say something about, I didn't get to go through this whole long list, but literary balloon peddler. A balloon peddler was a man in the late 1800s who would walk up and down DuPont with a festival of balloons. There were like 2 Chinese kids in the whole city, and he was up and down hoping a kid would come out and buy a balloon. And I think of King Kok, who just won the Lifetime Achievement Award, and Mona, and myself as literary balloon peddlers. Our job is to create a new generation. So what are you guys going to do? Let's hear from the students.
So I took Faye's class and Mona's class, also in KK's class at some point, and I took it with Ani. I'm
Tell us your name.
Chris Nguyen.
Chris.
I'm Asian American, Vietnamese American. That was a big important thing that we kind of discussed and talked about in our classes. I work specifically mostly in film, documentary narrative. A big thing for the last year, I was working on Sympathizer, and that was a big thing for my community and exploring that history. And I finally went back to Vietnam last year after we wrapped, so went to my family home, got to see where my grandparents came, weaving from the north down to the south, got to see the altar. So all those histories kind of intermingling coming back.
And I will not forget that story you wrote about the grandfather who spoke no English at the side, by the side of the road, and you were there, and he tried to tell you something, he tried to tell you something, he tried to tell you something, and you didn't know, and you wrote the character of not knowing. Have you finished it?
I'm finding my way of writing that in other to peddle those balloons. So in a way, it's ongoing. Yes.
Good answer.
In progress.
Yeah, for me, when I took Faye and Mona's class, and specifically Faye's class, she made us read out loud the first sentence of each story that we all wrote while we were beating the table out loud. And she said, imagine like a train passing, and you have to really say out loud the first sentence of your story. It has to emerge through all that noise. I will never forget that lesson, and I will never forget that day, because we were so loud. And then down the hall, there was this slam of a door, and Faye was like, that must be the poets.
Hi, Professor Faye. This is Leah from UC Berkeley. Just thinking about what you're saying about being a literary balloon or peddler, I think back to our class of spring 2020 when the pandemic had first started. I know we got a little shout out in the book, but I think I remember coming into your class and really thinking about how I was going to bring my just like modes of academia into the classroom, and you totally just completely deconstructed that for me. You looked at me and you were like, why are you taking notes? And I want you to treat this class as a cocktail party. And you know, with just everything going on in the world, I really formed camaraderie with a lot of the people in that classroom, and we had to go online and whatnot, but I really found my roots in writing and teaching through just looking at my fellow peers, not as just somebody who's sitting next to me, but as, you know, different beacons and windows into different stories. And so being able to write and also read the writings of my fellow peers really pushed me to pursue teaching. And I just wanted to say thank you. Yes.
Leah Augustine Wang, a beautiful, wonderful teacher.
Thank you.
There was a question over there. No? Yes? This gentleman with the brown jacket. Maybe it's a woman. I can't tell. Oh,
Hi.
it's Jade. Hi,
Yes,
Jade.
Hi.
It's dark. It's hard to tell.
So I wanted to ask, when you were, writing this book, if you had an audience in mind, especially in terms of, with immigration experiences, there's people who are, inside it and outside of it. And I was wondering if you were, feeling that you were writing for people who understood that kind of lived experience, especially with, some of your previous works, like, Bone was so engrossed in this Chinatown community that's kind of apart from the rest of the country in its own little world. So I guess, I was wondering if you had a reader in mind when you were writing.
I think that if I had a reader in mind, it would have been my parents, my great-grandfather, my grandmother, my grandfather in Cuba. I think it's the road to hell to think about living audience. I think my parents don't read English, so it was a safe thing. Although when I wrote Bone and it was about to be published, I came home from New York and I took my parents out to dinner and I explained to them what fiction was, and it came out sounding like, it came from my brain, and imagination was not a word I knew. So, and I was afraid that their friends with kids who read for gossip would tell them that this was a story about them. So in my mind, it's safe to say I'm writing for the dead because it brings them into the work, it keeps them alive. And I hope the living read it.
There's a question over here as well.
Hi, it's so nice to hear from your students because I was introduced to Bone in 2002 at UC Davis in an Asian American women writers class. But my question is, now that I finished the book, I really want to read, I think, Eat a Bowl of Tea. That's like what I want to read next. And I guess I was wondering if there are other books that would kind of complement Orphan Bachelors and extend kind of the experience of it.
There are a lot of books. There are two, I don't remember the title, there are two memoirs by men who confessed. There are two written, I think one was written with his daughter. There are great history books, May Nye, Gordon Chang, Erica Lee. There are so many books about these topics. Eat a Bowl of Tea is fantastic. Eat a Bowl of Tea was the first, written in the 60s, about New York Bachelor Society. I wrote the foreword. And let me tell you about deadlines. The deadline was July 3rd. I waited till July 3rd. And then I worked 8 days, 12 hours a day. And I got it in. But it took forever.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Is anyone brave enough to ask the last question? There we go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I kind of had a question regarding when you approach these subjects in history, and what do you think fiction allows you to do when you do approach these things that you don't think, sort of pure, or if that word ever really exists, nonfiction writing doesn't allow you to do? What do you think fiction lets you do when you talk about things like the Exclusion Act or, a lot of things these communities face?
I think that one should be able to create the full life in fiction and in nonfiction. It becomes a different way of telling the story, but the story of exclusion and confession is so large and so devastating that we need more books and more points of view. And are you a writer?
I wouldn't say so, but I'm studying English. So
There's only one answer.
then the answer is yes.
Okay, so just start. Okay. I have a question. Is Jane Louis here? Jane? Stand up. Jane Louis read the audible of Orphan Bachelors in beautiful, beautiful Cantonese cadence. Stand up. Everybody give her a hand.
Very kind. Thank you so much.
Jane Louis also was Opera Emily in Everything Everywhere All at Once. Give her another hand.
Yeah. I wasn't expecting that. Thank you for calling me out. It was such an incredible book to read, and in real time as I'm reading it, I felt very much, I felt softer towards my own family history and the burden that we all have, you know, as I'm an immigrant myself, and I just want to thank you for creating this piece and letting me do what I did.
And thank you for bringing it to life in voice and in powerful Cantonese.
Thank you.
She's a singer, she's a songwriter, she's amazing. And when you see Everything Everywhere All at Once, go straight to Emily, Opera Emily.
Listen to the book. Then we'll both get the benefit. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Faye will sign some books. Thank you so much.